There's a powder that costs about $4 a bag, and if you mix 1 cup of it into a gallon of water and spray your lawn, the broadleaf weeds start dying within a day, and the grass gets greener at the same time. Dandelions, clover, plantain, chickweed, creeping Charlie, all of it turns dark and brittle, while the grass around it deepens in color like it just got fed. That's not a trick of timing or a coincidence of weather. It's a straightforward chemical reaction between a mineral and 2 different plant structures that react to it in opposite ways. Most people have walked past this product at a garden center 100 times without knowing what it actually does, because it's usually sitting on a shelf labeled moss killer or lawn iron, tucked between the fertilizer bags and the grass seed. The active ingredient is ferrous sulfate, sometimes written as iron sulfate or iron 2 sulfate, and it's been used by golf course groundskeepers for longer than most modern herbicides have existed. This video covers exactly how it works, how to mix and apply it correctly, what it can and can't kill, and the precautions that keep it from going wrong on your particular lawn. There's something worth mentioning once, and then setting aside for the rest of this video. Everything covered here, plus a lot more: soil preparation, watering schedules, fertilizing timelines, the full year-round picture of keeping a lawn healthy instead of just fixing one problem at a time, is written up in a complete guide over at hankadvises.com. If that sounds like something worth keeping in a drawer and flipping back through later in the season, it's there. That's the only time it'll come up. Now let's get into the weeds themselves, starting with why they're such a persistent problem in the first place. Killing a weed by itself isn't difficult. Boiling water kills a dandelion. Straight vinegar kills it. A high enough concentration of salt kills it. Anyone could walk outside with a kettle and pour hot water on a weed and it would be dead by the next morning. The actual problem is killing the weed without also killing the grass growing an inch away from it, and that's a much narrower target to hit. Most weed control products handle this in one of 2 ways. Some are non-selective, meaning they kill anything green they touch, which forces you to apply them 1 weed at a time with a small brush or a targeted nozzle, a process that takes forever on a lawn with any real weed pressure. Others use synthetic selective herbicides, compounds like 2,4-D or dicamba, which are formulated to target broadleaf plants specifically while sparing grass. Those products work, but they usually run $20 to $40 a bottle. They contain synthetic chemicals some homeowners would rather avoid, and the lawn care industry has spent decades building brand loyalty around specific proprietary blends of them. There's a third option that predates almost all of that, an option that's mineral-based, inexpensive, and has been sitting quietly in the background of professional turf management for more than a century. Ferrous sulfate is concentrated iron in a water-soluble form. When it's dissolved and sprayed across a lawn, it produces 2 separate reactions depending on the plant it lands on, and the difference between those 2 reactions is the entire reason this works as a selective weed killer. Broadleaf weeds like dandelion, clover, plantain, and creeping Charlie have wide, flat leaves with a large surface area relative to their size. That shape means they absorb a disproportionately large dose of the iron solution through their leaf surface. At the concentration used for lawn treatment, that dose is enough to disrupt the plant's cellular structure. Within roughly 24 to 48 hours, the tissue breaks down, the leaves darken toward black, and the plant dies back. Grass, on the other hand, is a monocot with narrow, upright blades and a much smaller leaf surface relative to its root mass. It absorbs some of the iron too, but nowhere near the volume the broadleaf weeds take in, and the amount it does absorb gets used productively. Iron is a required nutrient for chlorophyll synthesis, so instead of causing damage, that smaller dose feeds the grass and often deepens its color within a few days. This isn't a workaround or a clever hack. It's a documented difference in how monocot and dicot plants take up and process iron, and ferrous sulfate is simply applied in a way that takes advantage of that difference. Ferrous sulfate isn't a new discovery or some overlooked internet trend. Sulfate of iron has been used in turf management since at least the early 20th century, originally as a way to control moss and toughen grass against fungal disease on golf courses in the UK, and later across North American turf programs. Greenkeepers noticed early on that iron applications did more than just green up the turf. They also knocked back broadleaf weeds and moss, without the heavy equipment or labor that hand weeding required. That practical side effect became a standard part of turf maintenance long before synthetic herbicides existed, and it never really went away in professional circles. It just stayed largely out of consumer advertising because there was no brand to build around a raw mineral. Agricultural extension offices and turf science programs at universities have published on ferrous sulfate's effects on broadleaf weeds for decades, and it's still recommended in extension bulletins today as a lower toxicity alternative for homeowners who want to avoid synthetic broadleaf herbicides. None of this makes it a secret, so much as a product that simply never needed a marketing budget to keep working. If a $4 bag of powder can do what a $40 bottle of synthetic herbicide does, it's reasonable to ask why it isn't the default recommendation at every garden center. Part of the answer is that ferrous sulfate has real limitations, which get covered later in this video, and those limitations matter. But part of the answer is also economic. A product that costs pennies per application and only needs to be bought once or twice a season doesn't generate the kind of recurring revenue that a subscription-based 4-step lawn treatment program does. Selective synthetic herbicides can be patented, branded, and bundled into seasonal packages that get marketed hard, often alongside fertilizer and pre-emergent products sold as a single system. Ferrous sulfate is a commodity mineral. Anyone can sell it, there's no proprietary formula to protect, and the margins are thin. That doesn't make it a conspiracy, it just means the products with the biggest marketing budgets aren't necessarily the only ones that work, and it's worth knowing what your options actually are before defaulting to the most heavily advertised one. The ratio that's commonly used and works well for lawn application is 1 cup of ferrous sulfate powder dissolved into 1 gallon of water. Stir it until it's fully dissolved and the water turns a dark amber color with no powder settling at the bottom. 1 gallon of that solution typically covers somewhere between 200 and 300 square feet, depending on how heavily it's applied, so an average front lawn might need 3 to 4 gallons total, and a larger property will need more. Measure roughly rather than mixing a huge batch and hoping the ratio holds, since too weak a mix won't damage the weeds and too strong a mix increases the risk of grass stress. A pump sprayer works better than a hose end sprayer for this, because a hose end sprayer dilutes the concentration unpredictably as water pressure fluctuates, and getting the ratio right matters here. Set the nozzle to a fine, even mist rather than a heavy stream, since the goal is to coat the leaf surface evenly without pooling liquid that runs off before it's absorbed. Walk in steady, even passes across the entire lawn rather than trying to spot treat individual weeds. That's actually one of the practical advantages of this method over targeted herbicide application, because the grass tolerates it and the weeds don't. There's no need to hunt down every dandelion individually. A full front lawn typically takes about 10 to 15 minutes to spray this way. Timing affects how well this works, and there are a few rules worth following closely. Apply in the early morning or the evening, not in the middle of a hot, sunny afternoon, because the solution needs time sitting on the leaf surface to be absorbed before it evaporates, and heat can also stress grass that's actively taking up a new nutrient load. Morning applications tend to work especially well because dew on the grass and weeds helps the solution adhere to the leaf rather than beating off. After applying, avoid watering the lawn, whether by sprinkler or hose, for at least 24 hours. If rain is in the forecast within that window, it's worth waiting for a drier stretch, because washing the solution off too early gives the weeds a chance to survive. Within about 24 hours of a proper application, the weeds usually start showing visible signs of stress. Dandelion leaves curl and darken at the edges. Clover develops dark spotting and begins to wilt. By the 48-hour mark, most broadleaf weeds are visibly dying or already dead, and the grass around them is typically a noticeably deeper green than it was before treatment. One application handles the majority of active weeds in a lawn. For a heavy infestation, a second application 2 weeks later is reasonable, but it's generally recommended to cap it at 3 applications per growing season, since repeated iron applications can gradually lower soil pH, which creates a different set of problems if left unchecked. Ferrous sulfate works throughout the growing season, but it performs differently depending on when it's used. Spring applications, typically once soil temperatures have warmed and weeds are actively growing, tend to hit broadleaf weeds while they're putting out fresh, tender leaf growth, which absorbs the solution readily. This is usually when dandelions and clover are most visible anyway, so it lines up well with when most people notice the problem. Fall applications serve a slightly different purpose. Cooler temperatures slow evaporation, which gives the solution more time on the leaf surface, and many broadleaf perennial weeds are pulling nutrients down into their root systems to prepare for winter, which can carry the iron down with them and produce a more thorough kill on the root, not just the visible leaf. Applying during the peak heat of summer is generally discouraged, not because the iron stops working, but because grass under heat stress is more sensitive to any additional input, and there's a higher chance of the treatment adding strain rather than benefit during that window. If there's one application a year to prioritize, late spring or early fall tend to give the most reliable results with the least risk to the lawn. It matters to be upfront about the limits of this approach, because overselling it would mean setting expectations that don't match reality. Ferrous sulfate is effective against broadleaf weeds, specifically dandelion, clover, plantain, chickweed, henbit, creeping charlie, ground ivy, and similar wide-leafed species. These are the weeds most homeowners are actually dealing with in a typical lawn, and ferrous sulfate handles them reliably. What it does not reliably kill is grassy weeds, things like crabgrass, goosegrass, quackgrass, or annual bluegrass. Those plants are structurally too similar to desirable turfgrass for the iron to selectively damage them without also stressing the lawn itself. If crabgrass is the main issue in a given yard, ferrous sulfate on its own isn't the solution, and a pre-emergent strategy applied earlier in the season is the more effective route for that specific problem. There's also a secondary benefit worth mentioning. Ferrous sulfate is highly effective against moss. Moss is extremely sensitive to iron, and a single application will often turn it black within hours, making this a useful option for shaded areas of a lawn where moss tends to take over rather than grass. There are a few practical warnings that matter more than people expect. First, ferrous sulfate stains. It stains concrete, pavers, clothing, and skin, because the iron in the solution oxidizes on contact with hard surfaces and leaves a rust-colored mark that's difficult to remove once it sets. When spraying near the edges of a lawn, keep the mist away from driveways, sidewalks, patios, and house siding. If it does splash onto concrete, rinsing it immediately, within seconds rather than minutes, is the best way to prevent a lasting stain. Wearing old clothes and gloves during application is a reasonable precaution, since it does stain skin, even though it washes off within a couple of days. Second, it's worth keeping pets and children off a freshly treated lawn until the solution has fully dried, usually somewhere between 2 and 3 hours. Iron sulfate isn't considered toxic at the concentrations used for lawn treatment, but wet solution on paws or bare feet can cause temporary staining and mild irritation. Third, avoid spraying on windy days, since drift can carry the mist onto ornamental plants or nearby flower beds that might react differently to the iron than turf does. It's also worth avoiding application right after mowing, since fresh cuts on grass blades can make the grass slightly more absorbent than usual, and giving the lawn a day or two to recover between mowing and treatment reduces the odds of any visible stress. Ferrous sulfate isn't a good fit for lawns with soil that's already acidic. Iron sulfate lowers soil pH slightly with repeated use, and if the pH is already below 6, additional applications can push it into a range where grass struggles to take up other nutrients properly, even if the grass itself looks fine in the short term. A basic soil pH test kit, which costs a few dollars and takes about 5 minutes to use, is worth running before starting any iron-based treatment, and it's a habit worth repeating once a year regardless of what treatments are being used. If the pH comes back at 6 or above, it's generally safe to apply up to 3 times over a season without issue. If it comes back lower than that, it's worth addressing the pH first, usually with a lime application, before introducing anything that pushes it further in the acidic direction. Skipping this step is one of the more common reasons people run into problems with iron-based treatments, not because the iron itself failed, but because the soil underneath it was already working against the grass before the treatment even started. A few mistakes come up repeatedly with ferrous sulfate, and most of them are easy to avoid once you know what to watch for. The first is mixing the solution too strong, assuming that more iron means a faster kill. It doesn't meaningfully speed up the process, and it does increase the odds of grass discoloration or stress, particularly on lawns that are already under some other kind of pressure like drought or recent mowing. The second is applying it and then watering the lawn the same day out of habit, which washes the solution off before it's had time to be absorbed and essentially wastes the application. The third is expecting it to handle grassy weeds like crabgrass, then concluding the product doesn't work when those weeds are still standing a week later. It was never going to touch them, and judging the treatment by the wrong weed leads to an unfair verdict. The fourth is applying more than 3 times in a season out of impatience, which risks pushing soil pH down further than intended. And the last one is skipping the pH test altogether, treating it as an optional step, when it's really the single biggest factor in whether repeated applications help the lawn or slowly work against it. Realistically, most people who use ferrous sulfate on a lawn with a significant broadleaf weed problem see visible dieback within 1 to 2 days and a largely cleared lawn within a week or two, with the dead plant matter breaking down and the surrounding grass filling into the empty space on its own over the following weeks. That last part matters, because it's the grass, not the treatment, that ultimately prevents the weeds from coming back. Ferrous sulfate only kills what's already growing. It does nothing to stop new dandelion seed blowing in from a neighboring yard, or seeds that were already sitting dormant in the soil. If the surrounding conditions still favor weed germination, thin soil, compacted ground, low mowing height, new weeds will eventually show up again regardless of how effective the last application was. The long-term fix is a lawn thick and healthy enough that there's little bare soil or light reaching the ground for weed seeds to establish in. That comes down to mowing height, watering habits, and a fertilizing schedule that supports dense grass growth rather than just green color. None of that happens from a single spray. It's a cumulative result of a few consistent habits applied over a season, and ferrous sulfate is best thought of as one tool inside that larger routine, rather than a standalone fix. The core idea here isn't complicated once it's broken down. Ferrous sulfate works because broadleaf weeds and grass process iron differently. One gets damaged by a dose the other one uses as food. Mixed at 1 cup per gallon, applied in the early morning during spring or early fall, left undisturbed by water for a full day, it clears most common lawn weeds within 48 hours, while the surrounding grass often ends up looking healthier than it did before. It won't touch crabgrass or other grassy weeds. It needs a soil pH above 6 to be used safely and repeatedly, and it does nothing to stop new weeds from arriving later in the season. Used with an understanding of those limits, and paired with basic mowing and watering habits that keep the lawn dense, it's one of the more cost-effective tools available for dealing with an existing broadleaf weed problem, and it's been sitting on hardware store shelves under an unassuming label the whole time.